During this hour, we have talked about the continent of Africa and the cost of carbon as it's being paid there. One issue that we haven't yet discussed is population, and I think it's important to talk about this issue in the context of Africa because by 2040, Africa will have more people than either China or India, and by the end of this century, Africa will have more people than China and India combined. So what does that mean for security, food security, water security, political security, and stability? Well, world population growth is now largely concentrated in the developing countries. This is actually a success story unfolding in slow motion because we now have a consensus in the world on what works to stabilize population. And there are four things that all have to be done and all are necessary, all are essential. The education of girls, the empowerment of women, also the availability of fertility management, and higher child survival rates so that parents are confident that their children will survive into adulthood. And as a result, that makes them feel, we know from history, we know from experience, more content to have smaller families, which has been the preference throughout human history. Well, we need to make sure that we have global policies that help to stabilize population by empowering women and families to make the choices that they want in order to have the family sizes that they want. Now, how does the population relate to food security? Well, look at this. This is a global overview of the world's food system here. There are usually huge surpluses in North America and South America and in Australia and from time to time in Russia and Eastern Europe. But Central America, Western Europe, Asia, and particularly Africa and the Middle East are constantly in food deficits. So when we have problems in some of the other parts of the world's food growing regions, this has an impact on Africa and all of the areas, particularly where there are food deficits. Now, the climate crisis hurts crop yields in these 5 ways. We see longer and deeper droughts, which hurts crop yields, bigger downpours and floods, and if that comes in the time of planting or harvest, that's going to be disruptive. The change in precipitation patterns, particularly subsistence farmers who've learned from their parents and grandparents when the rainy season and dry season usually come. The climate crisis changes all that timing and it creates confusion. They don't know when to plant. They don't know when they can harvest. We also see more pests and blights and heat stress. So there are a lot of experts around the world who are now telling us that what we need to keep an eye on with the cost of carbon is the cost that's being exacted on agriculture, on crop yields, and on food security. We see that in Uganda, for example, this is a study that the World Bank and some other institutions came up with a few years ago. This is the growing of coffee in Uganda, and the great areas are in green, and it's okay in orange there, but with a 2-degree increase, which is the world's target now, you see what happens. Most of the areas that were suitable no longer are suitable. And that's true not only for coffee, but unfortunately for a lot of food crops as well. The studies are now showing that in a world with more CO2, a lot of the pests become more active. They get more generations, and the plants sometimes lose their natural defenses to these pests. Also, heat stress. When the temperature goes above 84 degrees Fahrenheit or 29 degrees Celsius, for each day during the growing season that happens, corn yields, or maize as it's called in most of the world, declines by almost 0.75%. And using the U.S. as an example, by the end of the century, that could have an enormous impact. So heat stress has been underestimated as a factor in calculating the cost of carbon where food security is concerned. Now, water is significant for agriculture. A lot of people don't realize that 70% of global water use goes for agriculture. And when there are higher temperatures, plants need more water. Yet water supplies are under stress, partly because of population, some other factors, but you can see here that the projected increase in demand in sub-Saharan Africa is actually the third largest increase in water demand in the world. And the demands for agriculture growing in sub-Saharan Africa are larger than in China. So if you look at how we're going to meet these needs, this is the existing water supply that's accessible, and this is the increase in demand. That's a big gap. So we can become a lot more efficient in using water and finding water, and there can be some increase in supply, but still there is a remaining gap. So this is part of the cost of carbon. We've got to close that gap. Now, the Middle East and North Africa is the region richest in oil, but it's the region poorest in water and arable land. And in Northern Africa and throughout Africa, getting water is a daily struggle for millions. Already, there are a lot of countries that are at the maximum possible utilization rate for water, and the shortages are pretty severe in these countries. And we know that there has been a persistent drought through Niger, Chad, Mali, and Senegal, and this has had harsh impacts on people for many years. And while there are political factors and wars involved that contribute to these repeated famines, the experts are focusing our attention on the role played by the climate-related deep extended droughts throughout this region. Desertification is a problem, and again, politics plays a role, poor water regulation, but population plays a role with the taking over of cropland for urbanization, but the changing climate is a major factor. Rising sea levels, we saw the video in this hour. This is in Egypt, where rising seas push salt up through the water table into the cropland. Egypt is now trying to deal with the rising level of the Mediterranean Sea. Saudi Arabia tried to grow its own wheat by digging deep into the underground aquifer with all of these water wells, but they drained it so fast that they gave up on that strategy. Now they're trying to buy what's called embodied water by buying vast tracts of land in Africa. Now, it's important to note that fertilizer is overused in many parts of the world, but not in Africa, because they need to use more fertilizer. This is less fertilizer use in Africa than anywhere else, and less crop yields, in this case cereal yields. So nitrogen-based synthetic nitrogen fertilizer is a problem, but in some areas of Africa, more of it needs to be used. Now, why else is there an increasing demand for food? One is the shift to meat-intensive diets. And of course, in the West, we've long since done that. But for beef, for example, there's 7 pounds of plant protein required for 1 pound of beef protein. The drying up of these lakes, as we saw in the video about Lake Turkana, Lake Chad, what used to be the largest lake in Africa, dried up, and some of the refugees went east to Darfur, and it's one example of how conflict over water has increased political instability. Syria is the same way. Desertification, the loss of 60% of its fertile land, contributed to the tensions that led to political discord in Tunisia and Egypt and Libya and now Syria. So the cost of carbon in the form of political instability, drought, famine, and in all of these other ways is a very heavy cost to pay. So we have to put a price on carbon, and we have to put a price on denial. Luckily, we are seeing real advances in Africa with solar energy and wind energy, and we're seeing dramatic progress toward the exploitation of renewable energy sources, even the possibility of selling these resources to Europe. So in the next hour, we're going to turn to Asia. Stay tuned.